is your bride. We are standing here together.
Chapter 40, verse 1. In the 25th year of our captivity, at the beginning of the year, on the 10th day of the month, on the 14th year after the city was captured, on that very day, same day, the hand of the Lord was upon me, and he took me there. He took me there to the city that was captured, to Jerusalem. Now, this chapter brings us to the final timestamp of the book of Ezekiel. This is April 28th, 573 BC, 13 years after the destruction of Jerusalem, 25 years after Ezekiel was taken to Babylon. Ezekiel was in the second wave of exiles being taken there. Now, you won't get all this, but I have all the dates that are in the book of Ezekiel, and this last one right here, number 13, that is where we're at this time. So God, in a vision, takes Ezekiel to Jerusalem, and we're going to find out it's to the temple. And this happened previously back in chapter 8. God took Ezekiel to the temple. The temple at that time that was being profaned, that was being abused by God's people. And in this vision, Ezekiel had God's presence left the temple. Now, this was a spiritual leaving, but it was also a physical leaving as well, because once this happened, Babylon destroyed the city. Verse 2, in the visions of God, he took me into the land of Israel and set me on a very high mountain. And on it, toward the south, was something like a structure of a city. And he took me there, and behold, there was a man whose appearance was like the appearance of bronze. And he had a line of flax and a measuring rod in his hand, and he stood in the gateway. Now, in this vision, Ezekiel sees this city, and he meets this bronze man. Bronze represents judgment in the Bible. Does this mean anything? Maybe. There's one challenge I think we all have in Bible study. Sometimes we get hung up trying to figure out things that are not the emphasis of the text. So I'd encourage you just to be careful. So who is he? We don't know. This bronze man, I'm going to call him the tape measure guy, right? He's got a flax line, and he's got a measuring rod, okay? He's got a tape measure. Verse 4, and the man said to me, Son of man, look with your eyes and hear with your ears and fix your mind on everything I show you. For you were brought here so that I might show them to you. Declare to the house of Israel everything you see. So whatever this guy is going to show Israel, this is the emphasis of the text. Ezekiel was brought here by God so this guy could show him some stuff, right? And he says, fix your mind on everything I show you. So what follows is a detailed tour and measurements of a temple complex. And once Ezekiel's seen this, he is supposed to share what he has seen with Israel. Right? So far, so good. Verse 5. Now there was a small wall, there was a wall around the outside of the temple. In this man's hand was a measuring rod 6 cubits long, each being a cubit and a handbreadth. And he measured the width of the wall, structure, 1 rod, and the height 1 rod. So we need to clarify a few things. What in the world is a cubit? Well, a cubit is the distance between your fingers and your elbow. But we know that if we use the distance between my finger and my elbow, and we use Missy's distance, they're probably not going to be the same, right? So there was an average, which is about 18 inches, or 457 millimeters. A handbreadth, right? That's 4 inches. That's right here. Now, those can be different too. I got small hands. Somebody else has bigger hands. It might be different. So the average is 4 inches. So a cubit and a hand width is 22 inches, right? Just shy of 2 feet, 22 inches, or 558 millimeters. just shy of 2 feet 6 inches. Now, if that's what this rod he has is about 11 feet or 3 meters long, okay? We have a wall that is 3 meters high and 3 meters wide that is around this thing that he's seeing. So we're going to take a time out a minute, and we're going to discuss some views about these last 8 chapters of Ezekiel. See, the question is when and or how will this vision of this temple that we're about to be described be fulfilled? Now, there's 2 ways to look at it. Should we look at it as a literal fulfillment? Or is this a vision that is completely symbolic of the future perfection of God's presence among his people? Has it already been fulfilled, or is the fulfillment still in the future? This is I'm going to say an argument, but this is a discussion that is within the Christian realm of the world. So, if Ezekiel's temple is future, or is it fulfilled in the church age today? Is it the millennium, or is it now? Now, the answer will be determined by the interpreter's presupposition regarding literal or symbolic nature of prophecy and fulfillment. Right? Does that make sense? So if you believe that a lot of the Old Testament is symbolic, then you're going to go down that road. If you think that all of this is literal, you're going to go down a different road. We often lean to one or the other, and I would hope that maybe you would consider that at times it might be possible that it's both. Okay? So the literal fulfillment, let's talk about that for a moment. The literal fulfillment of the prophecy of Ezekiel's temple is considering the many details in Ezekiel's vision and the specific dimensions of the temple. If the vision is to be literally fulfilled, then the fulfillment must be in the future, because nothing like what has happened in these chapters that is being described in these chapters has happened yet. So at this point in our timeline, there was a tabernacle. Remember, that's just a fancy word for a tent. And David, he had built himself a house. Jerusalem was settled. And he's like, you know what? God lives in this cruddy old tent, and we should make him a temple. Remember, and he asked the prophet, and the prophet said, go for it. Then God spoke to the prophet and said, no, you can't do it. You're a man of blood. So Solomon built the temple. And this was a major, elaborate, wonderful thing. That was the temple that was destroyed by Babylon, what we've just read about in the previous chapters, right? That temple was leveled. 70 years later, Zerubbabel comes back and he builds a temple, and some of the guys that are younger are like, oh, we have a temple now. And the old guys are going, dude, this isn't nothing compared to what we used to have. That temple survived, and then this guy named Herod came along who liked to refurbish things and make things real pretty and stick his name on it. That temple was the temple that was around in Jesus' time, and then that temple was leveled in 70 A.D. by the Romans. There's no temple today. So if this is literal, then we have some future coming of a temple. The dimensions of Ezekiel's temple are far larger than Solomon's temple or Herod's temple at the time. Now, most who believe in a literal fulfillment of Ezekiel's temple expect this erection of this temple to be done in the millennial reign of Christ. Glorified saints from the present age will live in contact with natural human beings who will still need to make a decision for Christ in order to be saved. Many will choose to, and many will not in the millennial reign of Christ. Now, what we are going to find is that the sacrificial system is described here in Ezekiel for this temple. Now, we know that it cannot be for forgiveness of sins. Christ has accomplished that once and for all. The confusing part of this for many is misunderstanding the sacrificial system of the Old Testament in the first place. See, sacrifices in the Old Testament never took away sin. We read over and over and over again, like, for example, Abraham. Abraham, with his faith, right? They had faith in God for a future, right? Christ paying for our sins. So there was this exercise that God wanted to constantly remind the people that sin is serious to him and a blood sacrifice has to be made for it. Hebrews chapter 10, verses 1 through 4. For the law, having a shadow of the good things to come and not the very image of the things, can never with these same sacrifices which they offer continually year by year, make those who approach perfect, right? So he's saying, listen, sacrifices never did anything. Verse 2 and through 4. For then they would not have ceased to be offered. For the worshipers, once purified, would have no more consciousness of sin. But in those sacrifices, there is a reminder of sins every year. For it is not possible that the blood of bulls or goats could take away sins. Now you got to remember, the writer of Hebrews is writing to Jews, Hebrews, right? Yeah. So he's trying to explain to them something. He's saying, listen, Christ, all the stuff you've been doing, it's fulfilled in Christ, but you're doing it every year to remind you of what he has done. Sacrifices in the millennial reign are, in a sense, a memorial of Christ's death and the rites for ceremonial cleansing of the temple, but not a means of forgiveness of sins. Now, in the figurative view, or the figurative view, Ezekiel's temple, the prophet's vision, simply reiterates what once again that God dwells with his people in a perfect relationship. This relationship is described in the language that the people of the day, especially for Ezekiel as a priest, would have understood. The Jewish temple of magnificent proportions with regular perfect sacrifices, with the Messiah presiding, and with the glory of God visibly evident. See, in later visions to other prophets, God revealed more about how he would accomplish this with the Messiah himself, replacing the temple, the sacrifices, and the land. The presence of God through the indwelling of the Holy Spirit would be more immediately evident than ever before. The fulfillment of Ezekiel's temple could thus be realized in the church age to some degree and to the age to come to perfection, right? So I gave you a lot of words that say there's two different views of how this is, all right? And I hope you guys understand that. Now again, regardless of which approach someone may take, the vision of Ezekiel's temple is that God has not forsaken his people and that his relationship with them will be restored and elevated to a new, never before conceived glory and intimacy. Present circumstances should never cause one to doubt of the promises of God. Super applicable to us today. Now, as your pastor, Calvary Chapel, we're a Calvary Chapel, we take the literal view with the understanding that many of these applications can be made to the New Testament church. We do not believe that God has replaced Israel and his church, and we discussed a lot of that last week. So if you missed that, please go back and listen to that study. So, clear as mud? All right, let's go. Now, listen, we are not going to go through and read all the measurements in every detail. So verses 6 through 16, Ezekiel is describing the eastern gate of the temple. Now, Ezekiel's tour starts here at the east side of the temple grounds. It's the eastern gate which directly led to the entrance of the temple. The eastern gate is important, for though it and through it, the glory of God would return to the sanctuary. We'll find that out in chapter 43. Now, remember, Sunday, I showed you a picture, and we talked about the eastern gate and how it was closed up. right? Now, I don't have that picture, but I want to give you a picture of comparison of some real smart guys who have looked at all the measurements, and here's what they found out. So the one on your left is the temple of Ezekiel. The top right-hand corner is Herod's temple. That's the temple that was destroyed in 70 A.D. I can't read that far. Solomon's temple is this one here in the middle. The court of the tabernacle was an earlier, and sorry, but Logos had an American football field. So I want to give you kind of a little bit of proportion size to how big this thing is. Ezekiel's temple described here with his measurements are huge. Now understand something. Where the Temple Mound is today, that will not fit. It's too big. So you can do a little homework and find out how that would possibly fit. And we've discussed some of that in Revelation. We've discussed some of that earlier with some earthquakes and some other things that are happening. So obviously, if this is going to happen, the landscape has got to change tremendously, okay? Now, verses 11 through 16 describe something more of an entrance to the temple area, and this building was of substantial size with chambers and rooms all of its own. It says that he measured the gatepost 60 cubits high. So the gatepost of this eastern gate was like a tower. The structure was over 100 feet tall, 31.5 meters. And then I want to go to Ezekiel's temple. Picture of that. So if you're looking at it, your left, your right, that is the eastern gate that Ezekiel talks about. North gate, eastern gate, south gate. Notice there's no west gate. We'll get to that in a minute. So the outer courts, right? The outer courts are described from verse 17 through 19, and all of this is paved area, and the Bible describes it as being 2 levels. Chapter 45 will give us a little more detail. We'll get to that next week. The northern gate, coming from the east, Ezekiel's guide then takes him right to the northern gateway, and it is the same measurements as the eastern gate. Verses 24 through 27 describe the southern gate. This bronze man measures this gate, and they all have the same measurements. And we have details of decor, we have details of windows, and at the southern gate, there's 7 steps up. Then he goes to the inner court. Right there, see that? And there's 3 stairways coming up. The gates and the measurements are exactly the same, but there's 2 interesting things here described in Ezekiel's temple. There is no court of the Gentiles, and there is no court for the women. Now, this is interesting to note, because if you remember our study in Revelation, right, there was a temple that we looked at there. Revelation chapter 11. I'm going to put verses 1 and 2 up for you. Verse 1 says, "Then I was given a reed like a measuring rod, and an angel stood saying, 'Rise and measure the temple of God, the altar, and those who worship there.'" Verse 2. "But leave out the court which is outside the temple, and do not measure it, for it has been given to the Gentiles, and they will tread the holy city underfoot for 42 months. Now, again, if you want to listen to our Revelation study and talk about the detail of that, you can. But the point I'm getting at is that this temple here is not the same temple here in Ezekiel. Now, this discrepancy leads many to believe that the temple in the tribulation is the temple rebuilt by Israel, not this temple in Ezekiel. His temple has no need for the separation, right? Again, we see the old Jewish temple and the temple in the book of Revelation. There's a separation of the Gentiles, right? Now, even saying that, there's some very literal application there, and there's some very spiritual application there today for the church. Let's go down to verse 38. "There was a chamber in its entrance by the gatepost of the gateway. There were where they washed burnt offerings. In the vestibule of the gateway, there were 2 tables on 2 sides and 2 tables on that side. And each were to slay burnt offerings, the sin offering and the trespass offering. So again, we got Ezekiel's temple. So now we're talking right up there at the top of each of those stairwells, there's tables on each side. Coming into the inner court, there's 4 rooms, 4 tables, 2 on each side, and the preparation and performance of sacrifices. Specifically mentioned here are 3: the burnt offering, the sin offering, and the trespass offering. So let's review what those are really quickly. The burnt offering, that was an offering that was given, the entire animal was completely consumed and burned for the Lord, to the Lord. The sin offering, that was an offering for the sin of man. The meat and fat were burned on the altar, but the remains of the animal were taken outside the temple, outside the wall, and they were burned there. Now again, remember, no animal sacrifice ever paid for sin. This was a symbol of what was to come, right? The Lamb of God that takes away the sin of the world. Now, all of that, the burnt offering can be described, if you want to make a note, Leviticus chapter 3, the sin offering, Leviticus chapter 4, and the trespass offering, Leviticus number 5. And this offering was, in a sense, for unintentional sins, right? You just did something, and so everything was covered in the old system. Now, again, Ezekiel is describing here a prep area, so to speak, for sacrifices. And if this is the millennial temple, that means sacrifices are going to happen in the millennium. Verse 40. At the outer side of the vestibule, as one goes up in the entrance of the northern gateway, there were 2 tables, and on the other side of the vestibule, the gateway, were 2 tables. 4 tables were on this side, 4 tables were on that side by the side of the gateway. 8 tables on which they slaughtered sacrifices. So you got a prep area before, and now a killing table the next. Verse 42. There were also 4 tables of hewn stone for the burnt offering, 1.5 cubits long, 1.5 cubits wide, 1 cubit high. Of these they laid the instruments on which they slaughtered the burnt offering and the sacrifice. Inside were hooks and a handbreadth wide, fastened all around, and the flesh of the sacrifices was on the table. Okay, now, I'm just going to try to make this, it's a butcher's area, right? That's what it is. Now, again, we have a literal picture of sacrifice, the sacrifice process, to which Ezekiel, being a Levite, would have completely understood. This would not have shocked him in any way like it does some of us today. Now, to us, we might think this is barbaric, but this was God's design on how sin was dealt with before Christ came. 1 John chapter 4, verses 9 and 10. In this, the love of God was manifested toward us, that God had sent his only begotten Son into the world that we might live through him. In this is love, not that we love God, but that he loved us and sent his Son to be the propitiation for our sins. How many times today have you used the word propitiation? You haven't, probably. Propitiation means this is something that will please God, right? See, all that other stuff didn't please God. It was part of the process, but until Jesus came, God wasn't pleased until Jesus died for us. Now, listen, sin is really important to God. It's a serious thing, and we shouldn't take it lightly. The crucifixion was horrific. And he did that for you and I. Now, we can see that a figurative view makes sense in understanding that concept. We see a literal view is a bit more challenging for us to understand. Why this process needs to continue if Jesus has paid the price for our sin? Why would God have this sacrificial system continue if this is the temple in the millennial reign? Now remember, as we reviewed earlier, animal sacrifices were never actually effective for the cleansing of sin, only as a representation of the shadows of the future reality fulfilled by Jesus the Messiah at his crucifixion. Even so, the literal presence of these sacrifices does not mean that they should or could be regarded as effective for the cleansing of sin. Much as the bread and the cup at the Lord's table is a powerful spiritual representation of the memorial of Christ. Remember, after he died, he told us, he said, listen, whenever you do this, remember me, right? Remember, not that we're all sitting around the table having bread and wine, but you remember, I died for you, right? That's what we're to remember. Warren Wiersbe puts it this way. He says, the use of animal sacrifices in the millennial temple no more minimizes or negates the finished work of Christ than these sacrifices did before Jesus died. It appears that the sacrifices will be offered in a memorial sense as the expression of love and devotion to the Lord. They will also bring together people for fellowship, for feasting to the glory of the Lord. Now, as we continue in our study, as we finish this book, we will find that 3 times a year in this temple, people are going to be called to come and celebrate. We talked about this Sunday in the millennial reign. 3 times a year, you and I will be required to go to Jerusalem and celebrate. Now, don't ask me how that's going to work. I don't know. Like if you get super blessed and you get to live in Hawaii and you got to go to Jerusalem 3 times a year, I don't know how much that's going to cost. Do you take a plane? Do you just stay? I'm there. I don't know how it's going to work. All I know is it's going to be awesome, right? Everybody's going to want beachfront property, but anyway, maybe that's just my dream. Verse 44, outside the inner gate were the chambers for the singers in the inner court, one facing the south and the side of the northern gateway, the other facing the north side of the southern gateway. And he said to me, this chamber which faces south is for the priests who have charge in the temple. So we've got Levitical administrators, so to speak, and we've got a choir. Now, I find this a bit interesting, that there's going to be a worship team that is instituted at this temple. Now, remember, there wasn't a worship team until David instituted singers and the celebration and all that kind of stuff. We don't really read of the organized part of it until David is king. Now, here's the other interesting thing. In the New Testament church, we see 4 kind of, in a sense, offices. Prophets, apostles, evangelists, and teachers. But there's no worship leader mentioned. Verse 46. The chamber which faces the north is for the priests who have in charge of the altar. These are the sons of Zadok from the sons of Levi who come near to the Lord to minister to him. Now this is interesting. The sons of Zadok are called out here. Who are they? Well, we do know that there was a high priest Zadok who was high priest during the reign of David. Now, could this mean his descendants? See, if we go literal, that's a little bit of a challenge to understand. But we do know that Zadok supported David during the time when his 2 sons, Absalom and Adonijah, rebelled and tried to take over the kingdom. He's the high priest that anointed King Solomon. The word Zadok means righteous. This could also mean probably that only the righteous Levites will serve in the temple. Now remember, in our study through the Old Testament, especially through the prophets, 1st, 2nd Samuel, 1st and 2nd Kings, we had some Levites that weren't doing their job. They weren't teaching the people. They were just in it for whatever they could get out of it. Now, verse 47 through 49 describe the inner court and the foyer of the inner court. And he measured the court 100 cubits long, 100 cubits wide, 4 square. The altar was in front of the temple. Then he brought me to the vestibule of the temple. Vestibule is a nice name for a foyer. And measured the doorpost of the vestibule, 5 cubits on this side, 5 cubits on that side. The width of the gateway was 3 cubits on the side and 3 cubits on that side. The length of the vestibule was 20 cubits. The width, 11 cubits. And by the steps which led up to go to the pillars, by the doorposts, one side or the other. So this court here is 150 square feet. The foyer is 7.5 feet wide, 46 meters, and 30 feet long. That's the entry, sorry. The whole section is 30 feet by 16.5 feet. Now, in this description, there's something missing. The laver, the bowl of washing. But what is mentioned is the 2 pillars like in the Old Testament. Remember, they had names, Jachin and Boaz. Now, everything so far has been outside the temple. Chapter 41. Verses 1 through 4, the bronze man measures the inside of the temple. Look at the end of verse 4. It says, he measured the length 20 cubits and the width 20 cubits beyond the sanctuary. And he said to me, this is the most holy place. So Ezekiel, being a priest, could enter into this area. Only priest. But the high priest was the only one that could go into the most holy place, the Holy of Holies. Now, it's interesting here, there's a couple of things, again, that Ezekiel does not mention. He doesn't mention the laver. He doesn't mention the table of showbread. He doesn't mention the lampstands or the menorah, the golden altar of incense. He doesn't mention the veil. He doesn't mention the Ark of the Covenant. Now, again, there's some super good spiritual application for the New Testament church today in this, right? So verses 5 through 11, he had the temple walls and the chambers. These walls are 7.5 feet thick, 2.2 meters. There's 3 levels with 30 rooms on each level. And we're not told specifically what they're used for, maybe for the priests, maybe storage or tithes, we don't know. But we do know that there were storage areas in the old temple. Remember in Nehemiah, when Nehemiah came to clean house, if things had been going well, and then all of a sudden he goes back to the Persian king, he comes back again, and there's this Gentile named Tobias living in the temple. And Nehemiah goes like crazy ballistic and just goes in there and starts throwing his junk out, right? So what these are for exactly, we do not know. Verse 12, this is another interesting thing. The building that faced the separating courtyard at its western end was 70 cubits wide. The wall of the building was 5 cubits thick all around, and its length was 90 cubits. Now, on your left, we have a building on the west side of the temple. There is no building ever in any of the other temples like this. There's no gate on the west wall. What is this building for? Are you ready? We're not told. So listen, if somebody comes and tells you, I know what it's for, then they know more than Ezekiel, because he doesn't tell us. We don't know what this is for. Verse 13, so he measured the temple, 100 cubits long, separating the courtyard with the building and its walls over 100 cubits long. Also, the width of the eastern face of the temple, including the separating courtyard, was 100 cubits. So this temple building itself is 172 feet or 52.5 meters long. This is a big place. Verse 18. And it was made with the cherubim and palm trees, a palm tree between cherub and cherub. Each cherub had 2 faces. so that the face of man was toward the palm tree on one side, and the face of a young lion toward a palm tree on the other side. Thus it was made throughout the temple all around, from the floor to the space above the door, and all the wall, sanctuary, cherubim, and palm trees were carved. Now, 1 Kings chapter 6 tells us that Solomon had this same kind of decor. The design of cherubim was a prominent in both previous tabernacles and the temple. But there's an interesting observance here. Here, if you want to make a note, Ezekiel chapter 10, verse 14, cherubims are described with 4 faces. Revelation 4 tells us that cherubim have 4 faces. Here, there's only 2. What could this mean? But here's what I think is cool. Now, I'm super simplifying everything for you, okay? We have an angel and beach theme going on here, right? Palm trees and angels. I think that's cool. Verse 22, the altar was of wood, 3 cubits high. Its length was 2 cubits, its corners and its length, and its sides were of wood. And he said to me, this is the table that is before the Lord. Now, this isn't the same altar mentioned earlier in chapter 40, verse 47. This altar is too small for animal sacrifice. It's just over 5 feet tall, and it's about 1.5 meters wide, 3.5 feet deep. Now, most believe that this is the altar of incense, because the altar of incense represented the prayers of the people to the Lord. At the very end of the verse, it says, this is the table that is before the Lord. So putting a couple pieces together, and that's what most scholars believe. Now, the altar of incense stood inside the temple building, and it was covered with gold, not just a wooden table. Verse 23, the temple and the sanctuary had 2 doors. The doors had 2 panels apiece, 2 folding panels, 2 panels on one door and 2 panels on the other door. Cherubim and palm trees were carved on the doors of the temple, just as they were carved on the walls. A wooden canopy was in the front of the vestibule, and they were beveled window frames on the palm trees on the one side and the other, and the sides of the vestibule. Also the side chambers in the temple and on the canopies. Now, these canopies, again, are very interesting because they're not ever described as being covered in gold like the other 2 temples. Again, but we do have this angel beach theme going on. Now, we're going to stop right there, but I'll conclude with a couple of things. First of all, Ezekiel gives approximately 318 precise measurements of the temple using some 37 unique words that are architectural terms such as doorpost, windows, etc. He's received a wealth of information about this temple in the year 573 BC in the form of a vision and a personally conducted tour of this temple. Now, what would this have meant to the people in Ezekiel's day? Remember, the guy at the beginning of chapter 4, he said, listen, whatever you see, you got to look at it really closely, and I want you to go tell the children of Israel, right? So what would this have meant to them? First of all, we went through chapter 37, and we talked about those dry bones. Can they live? And we thought, what in the heck is all this about? And the angel was very clear, this is Israel. They will come back. Verses 38 and 39, we saw about this battle that comes futuristically, and Israel looks like they're done, and God comes in and saves the day. Now we see some sort of temple for them again. If you're just Jewish and you're in exile and you know nothing about all that other stuff I described to you before, this would have been super, super encouraging for those people. It would have offered them hope in the midst of being, in a sense, a prisoner in another country. So, big question. Is this the future millennial temple, or is this just symbolism for you and I to apply our lives to our lives today?
Jesus, come.